Well, I've said before in the last video that the Fantastic Four are my favorite characters yet to come to the MCU. They're not the only ones on the way. And, unlike the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, who are also coming, haven't been just disappointing in their movie outings. In fact, the X-Men have had some phenomenal versions of their characters brought to life on screen. And so there are a whole new set of problems that come with rebooting a franchise that at times has been incredibly successful. But before I get going on this, I just want to make sure that everyone here is getting the full experience of the Ploomination, so be sure to share, like, and subscribe. And check out my Patreon for even more stuff, links below. The X-Men are the foundational team for combating discrimination in the Marvel Universe. They represent the ultimate minority and are feared and hated by the very people that they have sworn to protect. That is their whole agenda. And this allows them to take the place of many minority groups without actually telling those stories in a way that feels too overt. The biggest issue that comes from talking about X-Men as characters on the screen isn't in fact which story to tell, but which characters from their roster are the ones to use. The Fantastic Four, while yes having occasional substitutes, have by and large been the same four core team members throughout their 60-year history. The X-Men, by strong contrast, have had close to 100 members in all manner of combinations with far less consistency and multiple lengths of tenure depending on the writer and the story being told, not to mention several offshoot teams that don't even count as official X-Men for some of these purposes. So for this, I'm going to be explaining the roles of various characters that I will also have to explain the team that I chose, who I think best represents an introduction to the MCU X-Men, why I think they would work best for that introductory story, as well as why I think a certain story in particular would be a good introduction into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I'll be getting into that in a bit. Just a few disclaimers. First, I'm likely going to be showing clips of prior portrayals of these characters. This is simply to have something in this video besides me talking with a black screen. It's not an attempt to endorse or showcase any aspects of these portrayals in any way. I'll tell you this, I like some of them, I don't like others, I'm going to leave it at that. Second, these are simply based on my own opinions of what these characters are and who they should be from both my readings and watchings of all of the different media. They are in no way the definitive versions of these characters, nor the definitive stories that will ultimately be told. I, like everyone else, am simply a fan who likes to imagine just as much as everyone else what possibilities could come of these characters. And finally, if you disagree with me on any of this, it is completely understandable. I just ask for civility and understanding. I get that we all have opinions, and I get that they're all going to be different, and you may see it some other way. Also, while this video was inspired by other creators making similar content, it is in no way bashing on their choices. Their choices are their own, and I do not want to say that they are wrong or invalid. All that being said, let's take a look at the X-Men and a few of their potential enemies by getting into some complex casting. So before I even dive into any aspect of these characters, I have to address why I chose the people that I chose. And to do this, I'm going to make a few different explanations. Starting out, a lot of the fan casting that I've seen always seems to start with the first class of X-Men: Cyclops, Angel, Beast, Iceman, and Jean Grey, aka Marvel Girl / Phoenix, along with Professor X. I don't want to do that. And the reason for that is that team has a single female character, and it leaves out a few characters from the X-Men that I feel like are vital to telling a well-represented story in the modern era, in a way that attracts comic book fans, as well as those who only know them from movies, TV shows, or just general public consciousness. I think we need to build some sort of perfect ensemble that has some of the major characters, but also understands that it's telling a story about diversity, and it needs to represent that. Likewise, I don't think a lot of the recent X-Men teams work quite as well either, and I don't know if I've ever seen a movie portrayal of a team that I felt worked. In arranging this idea, I ended up going through all of the X-Men characters, and I narrowed it down to about 15 or so, and then gave myself a criteria. I don't want to do more than 6 characters plus a Professor X, or an Emma Frost, or somebody who is sort of the person who stays back at the manor and guides the team from afar. I figured anything more than 6 is a little cumbersome, and that's a lot of characters to introduce really, really quickly in what is going to end up being probably a 2.5 hour movie at most. This is especially because when you looked at Eternals, part of the reason I felt that movie had issues is because it tried to introduce so many characters so quickly in a way that we didn't really get a satisfying and thorough development of all of them. And I want to make sure that these characters get developed in a way that you really feel like they're all individually important people, but also cohesive as a team. What ended up kind of narrowing down to my final final decision was me rereading what is arguably the best X-Men story out there, God Loves, Man Kills. This is the one that introduced William Stryker, and the team in it is essentially the best team I could think of, with most of my favorite characters, but also characters that I think most people would recognize and or understand or have heard of in some capacity. But there's one major change that I thought I needed to make, and I'll explain that in a second. The original team is Professor X, Cyclops, Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Shadowcat, and Wolverine. And I love all these characters, but I'm not going to use Wolverine. I think as Wolverine's popularity has grown, he's just too big of a character to put in something like this, which I think should be an ensemble picture. The goal of this movie should be to introduce the mutants, what they stand for, what they're up against, and how they overcome it, and show them doing that as a team. And Wolverine is the kind of character who I feel like would pull the focus away from that, at least at first. Plus, Hugh Jackman is so synonymous with Wolverine now that I think any aspect to reinvent or rediscover that character would ultimately just lead to comparisons and distract from the larger story. So I think that Wolverine is someone who should come in later, after a movie or two. I think that he is a great character. I think that he absolutely needs to be in the MCU. I just don't think that he should be on the X-Men's team the first time we meet them. So for this one, I want to keep the team and its values consistent, so I made one major change to that team, and I think it will help work this out. So my team for this video is going to be Professor X, Cyclops, Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Shadowcat, and one more surprise member, someone that I think will get a lot of the similar personalities as Wolverine, some of the details in there, and represent a lot of what the X-Men stand for, while also not overshadowing them and being a bigger player. So with that being said, let's break all these people down. Professor Charles Xavier is an idealist. He believes in a world where mutants and humans coexist in peace and harmony and wants to make that a reality through the example of his students. He is essentially Martin Luther King Jr. if Martin Luther King Jr. was a bald white man who could read your mind. But at the same time, he is also someone who knows that humanity is dangerous in the eyes of mutants, and mutants are dangerous in the eyes of humanity. And so he's not ignorant, he's just an idealist. Because of his psychic nature, Xavier tends to be a fairly compassionate and empathetic individual, mostly because, like I said, he can literally read minds and knows what people are thinking and feeling. And yet he's not above using his powers to his own personal advantages when he has to. He tries by and large to keep that kind of code of ethics, but sometimes he manipulates others when necessary, or even uses his powers to actively interfere on people's minds when he needs to get his way. And this has even caused him to destroy some of his biggest relationships over the years. And Professor X's role in the X-Men tends to be mostly as a mentor, the power behind the throne sort of character. He uses his high reputation in the community and his status to push the mutant agenda in a socio-political way, while using the X-Men to do so on a much more up-close and personal, dangerous level. Xavier often keeps himself at arm's length from the X-Men in a lot of situations, acting like he doesn't know them or he's not associated with them, even though he is. And mostly, Xavier is always of the belief that his goals justify any sacrifices he or his students will have to make, because those sacrifices will ultimately save the world for both mutants and humans and bring both of those communities together. And Xavier often has to be someone who can showcase a very understandable and completely thoughtful front, while also having this idea that he knows more than most people would expect, without tipping them off to the fact that he knows that because he can literally read their thoughts. He needs to be someone who presents himself as an authority and is respected, but never seems like a threat. Never seems like he's someone who could take you down, and doesn't actually present everything about himself up front. And yet he's always got to be a step ahead of everyone, without ever seeming like he is. And this ability to understand and see into the minds of others also reveals this other side of him, and that is his ability to blend his intelligence with his empathy. Charles can literally see into minds. I don't know how many times I have to say this. And because of that, he can feel what other people are feeling, or at least see the logic behind it. And this gives him a power, combined with his already incredibly high intelligence, to give the perfect pieces of advice to his students and his mentees when they need them. All in all, Charles needs to sort of have a subtle duality to him. On one side, he's a meek, humble, unassuming, willing to trust and rely on others person who does what he needs to get difficult jobs done. But then there's the other side of him that has to want to always be in control, who can never truly let the X-Men have full independence, and will even push back against his closest allies if it means getting the job done. And he's always got to have the willingness to do the right thing, even if it interferes with his goals, which always keeps him just a step ahead of everybody else, even to the point of manipulating people to keep that system. So to sum up, Charles needs to be someone who is both compassionate and empathetic, but also intelligent and cunning. He's an altruist and an idealist, well respected and steadfast in his goals and ideals. But he's also controlling, at times manipulative, and ultimately willing to make any sacrifices he has to push his agenda forward. Scott Summers is the perfect X-Man. I know that seems like a weird statement, but it's true. He's the ideal candidate for this team, and as such, most teams that lack Cyclops just feel like they're missing something. Scott's the first, he's the original, he's the one who's been there since the very beginning, and his mission has always been to accomplish the Professor's goal of peace between humans and mutants. But, unlike Xavier, Scott has faced the world more head-on, and as a result is far more practical in that aspect and far less idealistic. He is someone who sees solutions in a grounded way and tackles those problems head-on and makes those solutions come through with hands-on work. That's what keeps putting him in the leadership positions of the X-Men's field teams, because he just knows how to go out and get things done. And Scott's not someone who wants glory either. He doesn't do this because he thinks he needs it, he does it because he knows it's right. He knows that he alone cannot accomplish everything and is more than willing to lean on his teammates when he needs to do so. The darker side of this, however, is that Scott often sees himself in a very poor light, and he can think of himself as the least of his teammates. Because of this, Scott can often become obsessive over personal perfection and can occasionally push against the more extravagant personalities on the team because he can see them showing off these bright personalities as a threat to him. And that's not to say that Scott would not lay his life down for his teammates. He's the lead from the front type of leader, and he's a brilliant tactician with impeccable spatial awareness, likely due to the skill and ability that comes from his optic blasts. He can see rooms and understand exactly how to coordinate around them. And he's the one who will charge in front, whereas some leaders would send in the troops first and then come after. Scott is no way better than anyone else on the team, and he knows it. And speaking of those optic blasts, Scott's worst moment is the moment when those powers manifested, and it has caused him no shortage of trauma. The common idea that he lost his parents at the same time that he lost control over his powers has only escalated this obsessive trait, and it's caused him to strive for absolute control over everything else that he can have control over. And this includes the team from time to time. Not only that, but Scott also blames himself for failures. Even when he has very little to do with them, it's his fault. He obsesses over how he could have planned better, communicated better, done more in the moment, and that obsession can be crippling to the point of seclusion and even self-doubt in the face of what most would see as very trivial issues. All this is to say that Scott is better than Scott feels he is, and him constantly striving for perfection also requires some form of desired validation, even though Scott doesn't think that he deserves validation, especially from himself. All in all, Scott needs to have the outward confidence of a seasoned leader, someone who can make split-second decisions without a moment's hesitation, but also someone who knows that sometimes he has to take a step back and let someone else take the glory. He has to be obsessive to the point of horrendous self-doubt and guilt, and he needs to be driven by his past trauma and this need for incredible control. And ultimately, he will likely see himself as the least important member of the X-Men, while actually being the most important one of them. So to sum up, Scott should be brave, selfless, a leader, guilty, obsessive, aloof, straightforward, controlling, loyal, full of self-doubt, supportive, and highly capable while being humble about his skills, talents, and gifts. In my mind, you cannot have a modern X-Men team without Aurora Monroe. My whole idea for not using the First Class team came because I just couldn't figure out how to make this team work without her on it. I mean, obviously there have been X-Men teams that didn't have Storm, but in this day and age of diversity, change, and representation in the media, which the X-Men have to be the standard bearer for, I don't feel like you can make a valid X-Men team and not include Storm on it. She is arguably the most famous black female character in all of comics, and for good reason. And I feel like a team that empowers diverse voices and speaks to diverse issues needs her on it. Aurora is a contradictory character in many ways. She's very mighty, beautiful, strong, and confident, and she's someone who at one point was literally worshipped in Africa for her abilities and positions, and that led her to not only become a woman of power in her own right, but eventually a queen of Wakanda and the wife of T'Challa, the Black Panther. Storm is descended from greatness, and she knows it. Her striking and iconic appearance was present even before her powers manifested. Her mother was a literal Kenyan princess. And because she lost her parents and then suffered a lot of hardship at a young age, one of Storm's most essential qualities is that she is incredibly self-reliant. She's been on her own in some form for so long that she absolutely has this edge of looking over her shoulder and not fully trusting anyone completely at first, maybe even ever. She's also got very strong convictions towards herself and does not want to compromise those ideals. The other thing that doesn't come up a lot is she's one of the smartest X-Men. The teams that we've seen before don't really portray Aurora as the thinker. They usually have one of the more sciencey X-Men to do that, but Aurora could actually take that position in the team and use what she has, which is incredible intelligence, to be the person who thinks things through. And she's got a strong will, which of course means that she can be exceptionally stubborn, but she's also been proven to fend off some of the most mentally savvy psychics out there when she's at her peak. Another thing that shows her intelligence is that she's a polyglot. She can speak tons of languages, some of which might even seem surprising given her upbringing and where she's from. And this could come into play in fun and surprising ways. Aurora's on an away team to some country where they don't speak the language, and suddenly she just knows it, and no one saw it coming. On top of this is the ability to outthink Scott all the time. And that makes great character conflict because those two characters could have egos that continue to butt heads. But this brings us to some of Aurora's biggest faults. As I already said, she doesn't trust people easily, and she keeps people at a distance, even when she doesn't realize it. That being said, she does have a heart for young people, especially those she sees as parallels to her own story. This makes her the obvious choice to be Scott's second in command because she contrasts him really well. He's tactical and practical, she's heartfelt and smart. So because of this, Aurora's personality in the field is motherly, both in a tough love, but also kind of open when she needs to be sort of way. And as I said, a lot of this sounds contradictory. Well, it's because it is. Aurora's had a lot of past hardship and trauma, and that causes her to have very strong emotional reactions. And that in turn can affect her powers, which is always really fun. The most notable version of this is caused because she has claustrophobia due to being trapped under rubble as a young girl. And when she's in enclosed spaces, she shuts down. She goes from someone who is godlike and incredibly confident to just someone who is helpless, paralyzed by fear, unable to do anything. Aurora is also someone who grew up in a very different world than the other X-Men. She's gone from being orphaned at a young age and running on the streets to ruling nations, and her knowledge of how the world works feels like it should be off. I feel like of all the X-Men, she's the one who doesn't fully understand all of the customs and the idioms and the things that go into who people are. And these differences often lead to frustration with several other X-Men, especially some of the younger ones, because they grow agitated with Aurora and her demand for respect while lacking basic understanding of how people function in the world. And above all else, Aurora knows herself. She knows her values, and she is strong in the face of adversity. She is not someone who lets herself be talked down to, belittled, or stepped on by anyone. And she takes a long time to give people her unconditional respect, and no time to take it back when they lose it. But she knows her past, and she knows her place on this planet, and she will fill that place with devotion and loyalty towards everyone and everything, even those others would see far beneath her, once they've earned her trust. She is a servant of the world and of its people. All in all, Aurora is a confident, powerful presence. She should be striking and compelling both physically and mentally. She should be unapologetically smart and relentlessly determined. She should resist the influence of others, but not be above hearing their words. She should be initially very cold and untrusting, but very warm and full-hearted with those who have earned her trust. She needs to be emotionally strong, but also unstable at times. And she can have the self-confidence and awareness to know her place, even when that puts her at odds with some of her closest allies. And above everything else, Storm should be the embodiment of the ideal world the X-Men strive to create. So to sum up, Aurora is confident, powerful, emotional, smart, strong-willed, somewhat untrusting, loyal to those she loves, giving, courteous, noble, self-aware, battered by her past, motherly, defensive of her teammates, and uncompromising of herself even to a fault. Peter Rasputin is a white hat in every sense of the word. He's also the ultimate supporter of his fellow X-Men. What makes Colossus so interesting is that he, by all appearances, is the flashy, out-in-the-front member of the team. But when you actually get to know him, you find that he might be the gentlest member of the X-Men by a mile. He's often described as shy, sensitive, artistic, and overall just a very well-rounded guy. Peter makes sense as the most well-adjusted member of the team. Unlike many of his fellow team members, he didn't suffer a tragic tragic loss, nor did he get rejected from society, forced to use his powers as a means to survival. He was accepted by his family and actually used his powers practically to help them and their neighbors until such time that he was asked to join the X-Men. All that is to say, Peter doesn't really fit the mold of a usual team Brick, the character with immense super strength who runs through walls, catches falling debris, and lifts unbelievable amounts of weight. Often these characters tend to be the show-offs, the loud, boisterous figures who run into battle recklessly. Think like the Thing or the Hulk, these big, aggressive people. But Peter does this because he knows it's his duty, and even so, he does it reluctantly. Peter is a peaceful, quiet person. He prefers a simple life away from all these troubles, but his sense of loyalty to his family, both his birth family and his found family, compels him to continue to protect those around him and use his gifts responsibly. And he truly views his powers as gifts. Unlike a lot of the others, Colossus's powers come with very few drawbacks. He's stronger, faster, bigger, and tougher in his armored form, and it helps that his family accepted it as an asset early on. However, that also means that Peter can be a bit naive when it comes to the struggles of the other characters. And because of that, he's a little blunt at times, saying or doing things without meaning to upset others, but doing so anyway. It's easy to see your powers as a blessing when you've been able to use and value them without torment, pain, trauma, or discrimination. Peter may realize this, but he doesn't understand why the others don't see it the same way. And that's not to say that Peter doesn't care about his fellow X-Men. In fact, he is probably the most loyal to them of anyone out there. He's probably more loyal to each individual X-Men than they are to each other, even when he's not as close to them on the surface. And he's incredibly honest as well. As I said, sometimes bluntly so. He's actually been described by several of the older X-Men as the little brother of the team, mostly just because of his lack of understanding and his age when compared to a lot of his fellow X-Men. But he carries that title willingly and well, and is absolutely willing to step in and be the little brother supporting his fellow teammates, his older siblings. But like everyone, Peter does have a dark side. He's not afraid to cross the line to ensure that the job gets done and that peace remains. Not only this, but he also hasn't suffered a lot of personal hardship when he joins the X-Men, so each major failure is crushing for him. It causes him to really doubt his desires to continue on the team, and him seeing himself failing for the first time hits a lot harder when you haven't had those failures in the past, like Cyclops or Storm might have. And he keeps going because at the end of the day, he always puts the needs of his friends and teammates over his own needs and desires. So much so that he often takes massive amounts of time to complete his own personal goals. Peter is incredibly committed to this sense of duty. He's not in this game for himself even a little bit, and he throws himself in harm's way even if it means he might not be coming back from a mission. One of his most famous storylines was him sacrificing himself to cure the legacy virus that would have ended mutant kind, and he was more than willing to make that sacrifice again, even up to the point where people see his sacrifices as selfish and not understand his overall motives. But Peter will always put himself last and do whatever is best for the rest of the team rather than for himself as an individual. And finally, it's worth mentioning that he's had a long-standing on-again, off-again relationship with Kitty Pryde, aka Shadowcat. This relationship is not perfect, and it's often hindered by Peter's overwillingness to sacrifice himself, as well as his naivete towards romance and his tendency to fall in love with others without realizing it. But I think it's important to note that this is a plot point in the comics, and one that the movies have not explored to this point. And I'll explain why I think it's something that should be explored here a little bit, but just know that more often than not, it's Peter who is often more emotionally vulnerable, and therefore the one who ends up getting hurt by the relationship. All in all, Peter is a strong, sturdy man with absolute trust in his convictions and purpose within the X-Men. He often lacks understanding of the world and all its complexities, including the people around him, but he is loyal to a fault and views himself as far less important than any of his teammates in the long run, often making dangerous choices for himself just to keep them safe. He is willing to put his own desires last and help his fellow teammates whom he views as his family, and will never complain about how little he gets to invest in himself. He is the ultimate little brother of the team, and yet is also the most devoted, steadfast good guy the group has in the end. But that has a dark side because his failures lead to tragedy and hurt, and he has no emotional shields to understand how to deal with it. So to sum up, Peter is loyal, selfless, dedicated to his family, whatever he deems them to be, deeply quiet and self-contained, selfless to the point of seeing himself as the very least of his team, naive, emotionally vulnerable, romantic, and obviously very sturdy and strong, while being sensitive and open. Kurt Wagner is defined by faith. It's an interesting irony that the member of the X-Men who most resembles a stereotypical demon is the one who actually has the strongest faith in a higher power, and uses that faith to give him this enduring optimism and drive to do good for those around him at any cost. That being said, while his personal faith is a major driving part of his motivations, he doesn't throw it in people's faces, instead applying the virtues to himself and using them to help lift up his teammates. A major way that Kurt does this is that he's funny. He's the clown, he's the prankster, he's witty. He often makes light of even the most difficult situations, and he sees that there is always a reason to laugh. He is spontaneous at times, and this tendency to clown around can sometimes get him to the point where he's in trouble. He can often go too far or poke wounds and insecurities without meaning to, but deeper down is a real hard truth. He tells jokes and clowns around because he's covering his own insecurities about himself, and he's using humor as a deflection tactic. Deflection is such a defined part of Kurt's personality that it's reflected in his powers. He's agile, he's able to leap and tumble around, he can teleport, he just avoids blows rather than taking them. And even more than that, he has this ability to hide in the shadows, revealing himself when he's fully ready. This is how his insecurities operate as well. He dodges direct questions, moves away from tense situations, cracks jokes to diffuse tension, and waits cautiously before revealing his full self to someone because he's ashamed of who he is and where he comes from. And part of this deflection tendency is translated into Kurt as the showman. He grew up in a circus, and he learned that people were more forgiving of him when they saw a value to him or saw him as just an acrobat in a costume. Kurt found value being an entertainer for circus audiences and found that they did not treat him the same way offstage as they did on it. And he learned to sword fight with the swashbuckling styles of Errol Flynn because he found that interesting and added to his personality. But when Kurt's not showing off, he's often very quiet, reserved in times of deep reflection. The moments where he requires action allow him to put on this false sense of confidence and bravado because he doesn't want anyone to know just how insecure he is. And because of this, Kurt is sometimes asked to step up and lead. He's not as forward and tactically sound as Scott or Aurora, but his ability to connect with his teammates earns their trust and shows that they value his insights and can often see him as a leader even when he doesn't see himself as one. This aspect of Kurt is so genuine because he is a leader through empathy. He connects and he sees the value in people. There is something so powerfully sincere about Kurt once he does let people in. His own experience as a constant outsider from society has given him this very unique perspective on the world. And then when you combine that with his religious faith and how he applies it to himself, Kurt's willingness to connect with his fellows and see the goodness in all people regardless of initial appearances is incredibly empathetic and helps him earn respect from all members of the team while giving them the same respect. He's willing to look past the surface and dive deeper into the very souls of his fellows, giving them the courtesy that he never got in his earlier life. And because of all this, Kurt's appearance is crucial to the character. He is often the prime example of the inherently evil member of the mutants because he happens to look like a demon. He is the perfect example of racism and judgment based solely on appearances, even more so than the X-Men who are actually of different races. However, he's also the kind of man who follows in the footsteps of Christ and will bear that cross and find those good parts of those who scold him, forgiving them in the process. He is Charles's best representative for defending that world that fears and hates him. And all this is without even addressing his biggest and most complex relationships, those with his parents. Kurt is the product of two X-Men villains, Mystique and Azazel. One, a shape-shifting rogue who goes on missions and kills people, and the other, who literally accepts the moniker of the devil and tries to use it for his power. For a man like Kurt, who is so good, fighting to break the cycle of abuse from his parents, ones he never knew as anything other than antagonists and villains who have hurt him over and over again. And if those relationships are ever explored in the movies the way they are in the comics, it's one of the things that shakes Kurt's faith. This is an important thing to see because it's a relationship for growth. Either Kurt will be provided with a reason to bolster his faith and search for the goodness within his parents, one of whom, as I said before, literally inspired the devil, or for Kurt from breaking for his faith, even temporarily, and seeking new purpose, trying to redefine himself. Both would be great ways for this incredibly interesting character to grow, both with and apart from the X-Men. All in all, Kurt is a man devoted to his beliefs. He has great faith in both his teammates and God to the point where he wants everyone to find that hope that he feels in all things. Kurt is relentlessly optimistic, at least on the surface. Kurt often pushes his true insecurities aside and avoids direct confrontation because of his past trauma and his distant relationship with many other people. But he's a showman who naturally likes to add flair and drama to things while not taking anything too seriously. And above all of this, he looks like a demon and he knows it. And he chooses not to do what others have done to him and see the good in people first before their appearances. And if you can't tell by this point, he's my favorite X-Men character, and he's been so pretty much since the beginning. So to sum up, Kurt is witty, performative, devoted, optimistic, insecure, reflective, faithful, uncertain, and willing to see the truest version of people. Not the character they present, but the one they are in their heart of hearts. And he represents everything the X-Men stand for, possibly better than anyone else. Catherine Pryde, aka Kate, aka Kitty, has probably grown more than any other X-Men. She was the first new inductee after the second generation was added and came in as a child amongst seasoned adults. She had this initial curiosity and wonder that comes from working with this unbelievable group of individuals, and she was someone who searched for solid footing in the world and continues to reinvent herself to find that perfect place. In other words, Kitty's story is one of continuously redefining herself and passing through obstacles both literally and metaphorically to achieve that redefinition. Kitty begins her journey with the X-Men young. She is the youngest member of the team the X-Men have ever had. She was an optimistic 13-year-old who thought the world was ready for her to succeed. She's smart and spunky and becomes this kid sister for many of the other X-Men, but she quickly learned that there's a lot of hardship and hurt in the world that she didn't see. And this process begins to break her down and show her that she needs to fight for things, including herself. Kitty has a unique secondary reason for aligning with the X-Men, and that's her heritage. She is still very close to her family, both immediate and extended, and her family, like Peter's, have been supportive of her journey as a member of the X-Men. And that's because they're descendants of Holocaust survivors, and so she's heard first-hand stories of the absolute worst of the worst as far as cruelty of humanity, and how they can turn on each other for trivial reasons such as race, class, gender, and even genetics. She's on edge about when and to whom the next version of the Holocaust could ever occur, and sees mutants as a potential target of that same violent destruction. And as a result, she has very strong convictions and is willing to fight back against any sort of oppression, and that makes her very guarded and very cautious. And that's not to say that she hates everyone. In fact, she often probably finds more compassion for oppressed people more than any of her other X-Men. In fact, she's one of the X-Men who had a decent relationship with longtime enemy Magneto before anyone else did, because they shared this connection to the Holocaust, and it was her who showed that he was taking his vision for mutant superiority too far by becoming the very thing he was fighting against. And this connection only continues to grow over time, with Kitty becoming one of the biggest allies for Magneto's redemption within certain comic stories. Kitty's compassion also comes with another side, though, and that's that she is incredibly blunt. Kitty's upbringing causes her to be very, very direct. She's to the point on everything, and sometimes this bluntness can cause her to seem overly harsh at times, even when she doesn't mean to be. And this can cause her to say things that people don't always want to hear, even if they need to. Not only that, but Kitty does this in a snarky way too. She's got all kinds of biting comments which pierce even the closest of her allies. This snark comes from her very absolutist way of looking at the world. Kitty sees things as a certain way, and there is no qualms righting the wrongs that she sees. She's been one of the X-Men who famously calls out national figures to their faces or in big public events, such as when she accosted Reverend William Stryker for his prejudice towards mutants on his own national telecast. This absolutist mindset also makes her less loyal to the X-Men as an idea and more willing to go away from them to something that she feels better represents her ideals. As a result, Kitty is fiercely independent. She's frequently clashed with other members of the team and refuses to compromise when she sees that they aren't promoting the same peace she joined them to bring about. But she also has moments where she herself challenges these ideals that she holds and struggles to find the truth behind her own shortcomings. And all of this development occurs over a long span of time. Kitty is still often seen as the kid. Even when she emerges as a leader and a mentor for younger mutants, she still finds herself lacking the full trust of her teammates, and over time grew less connected to them as a result. Part of this is her stubbornness, and part of this is also her fear of seeing herself as a victim, someone who is oppressed. And this brings us to her relationship with Peter. Peter is such a devoted member of the X-Men, and he is frequently sacrificing his own beliefs for those of the team. And it takes Kitty a long time to see that this is counter to her values. When they got together, she was young. She was still figuring herself out, and as she grew up, she realized that she was outgrowing Peter. Yes, Peter is big and strong and handsome, but that childhood affection slowly wears away when she realizes that Colossus is still too naive and will not spend her life tethered to him. Their relationship is one of the things that helps Kitty grow over time. time, and her frequent struggles in relationships have actually caused her to question herself and why those relationships failed. And this has led her to discover that she is in fact bisexual, and needs to figure out how that fits into her life before she could commit to anyone fully, realizing that these issues are not from others, but as a result of her still growing to accept herself. And that, like many of the other things that we've mentioned, is absolutely something that needs to be represented in stories like this. All in all, Kitty needs to be someone discovering herself. But she also needs to be someone who knows what she values in the world. She needs to be someone who sees deep compassion for the oppressed around her, and she will call out anyone without hesitation, including her teammates. She needs to be stubborn about those things that she cannot compromise on, and bluntly tell others when they are wrong. And she needs to be struggling from approval from her fellows while asserting herself as a valuable member of the team and potentially a leader. So to sum up, Kitty needs to be curious, steadfast, compassionate, blunt, unconcerned with how she's seen, an absolutist on what she thinks is right and wrong, fiercely independent, overlooked by her peers, willing to step up when the need arises, and overall constantly growing into the person that she's meant to be. And then we have my final member, the one that I chose specifically. I went through several variations before coming to this conclusion. The person I chose is there to fill a few specific criteria that I think will both help round out the team and show what they stand for better. First, as I've already said, I wanted to avoid Wolverine, let him get introduced somewhere else, don't let him steal the focus from this larger team. But I wanted to keep some of the qualities of Wolverine. Second, I wanted to try and get someone who was maybe a little less known to general audiences, someone like the Guardians of the Galaxy, who come into the MCU and kind of emerge as fan favorites over time. And third, I wanted to have a different history and personality than any of the other X-Men that I've already put on the team, someone who comes from a place that we haven't really seen or heard stories about. Fourth, I wanted someone who would actually enhance that representation even further, diversify the team even further, and who has ultimately lived a very different life than any of the fellow X-Men. I also felt like this role should be someone younger, someone who kind of takes the place. Introduce the X-Men as a seasoned team. This is the rookie. This is the intern. This is someone who is growing into either this team or developing into a spin-off team down the road. All this came together in a way that I think will not only complete this group, but also make up for a past omission that have many fans upset. And that person is... Jean Coiman has survived everything. That sounds like an exaggeration, but she has been displaced, abused, traumatized, violated, and broken. Of the characters to carry the X-Mantle, very few have ever had the tragedy that she's had in the short amount of time that she's had it. And all of the major tragedies she's encountered were before she was even found by Charles Xavier. She impressed Charles, and he chose her to lead the young team of New Mutants, which she has been a constant member of ever since. And that makes her omission from the movie, well, understandable from a popularity standpoint, very unfortunate and confusing. Firstly, Jean originally grew up in Vietnam, and in the original timeline, she was born during the Vietnam War to a South Vietnamese colonel who was forced to bring his family onto his missions to keep them safe. She literally grew up in a war zone, and as a result, her powers, physically possessing the minds of other people, manifested far earlier than everyone else. This is often consistent with the way that trauma triggers puberty in people. They're forced both physically and mentally to grow up before they're ready to, and so was Jean. And unfortunately for Sean, the trauma doesn't stop there. Her family ended up fleeing Vietnam, and as a result got separated, with her twin brother Tran leaving with her crime lord uncle, and Sean cramming onto a boat with her family. And I want to give a content warning for this next section because it is traumatizing, but it has to be mentioned. It was then that Thai pirates took over the boat, killed both of her parents, and raped the young Sean. I say this because it speaks to her will to survive. She suffered the worst horror a person can face and is still willing to stand up and fight for others. And that shows strength. And that strength of character is one of Sean's most important traits. She is willing to stand up for everyone. Surviving an ordeal with pirates allowed her to arrive in New York, where she reunited with her twin brother, but her crime lord uncle, who demanded that she use her powers of possession to fight his battles for him, kidnapped and threatened her other siblings, whom she was now in charge of protecting, as both her parents were gone, and she was the oldest. She refused to help him, and eventually used her powers with the aid of other superheroes to fight back against both her uncle and her twin brother, and she she ended up absorbing her own twin brother to prevent him from turning many of the world's superheroes on humanity. And again, all this happened prior to Professor Xavier finding her and letting her join the school. She was barely a teenager and had already survived war. She'd grown up too quickly. She'd been orphaned. She'd protected her siblings. She'd been physically and mentally violated in every way imaginable, and ultimately had to kill one of the only other people on the planet who could have actually completely understood her. I tell this backstory because I know that she's not the most well-known of characters, and it's important that everyone understands where all of her qualities come from. What all of this trauma did for Sean is made her very tough, very closed off. She is cold to everyone and everything. Even more than Aurora, she does not trust anyone, and she is wildly ashamed of her past and how little she was able to do to stop atrocities that occurred around her. And so, Sean refuses to roll over and accept her failures, and that makes her a hard, determined person who wants to do better than her past would have you believe. And this causes a lot of baggage. First, she's extremely devoted to her family, not her X-Men family, her siblings who are still alive, and when they get threatened, she will give anything to save them. I think something like this adds really cool complexity to a team, because it's someone who would divide their allegiances. In a moment of sacrifice, they would go off their own way, and the team would struggle because they weren't there. And seeing how their choices affect more than just their teammates is really interesting. But again, Sean doesn't trust anybody, and I mean her closest allies as well, and this can make her a liability. She's someone who will go off on her own. And it makes sense, the people closest to her, including her own twin brother, turned on her before she even reached adulthood. Because of this, she'll go alone into situations well beyond her control and ultimately cause the team to struggle because they have to save her on top of completing a complex mission. But at the same time, a lot of these traits develop Sean into a leader. She's not a leader because she's the most tactically sound or the most competent at running a group of individuals, but because she is someone who's done nothing for herself her entire life. In much the same vein as Peter or Scott, she sees her purpose and place on the team as the least important member of it. Unlike Peter, though, she doesn't see this as a need to sacrifice herself, but as a reason to keep pushing forward. She survives because she needs to make sure that everyone else survives too. She has to make up for the past failures that she's experienced. And yet, she continues to find hardship and struggle, and that just reinforces her ideals. Or more to the point, hardship and struggle tend to find her. These hardships further place her as the ultimate embodiment of everything that the X-Men represent. She lost a leg, becoming a member of the disabled community. She was possessed and became chronically obese, dealing with the standards of body image and struggles that women take place in society. And she was one of the first out lesbians in all of comic book history, which cements her firmly in the LGBTQ+ community and the thing that X-Men best correlate to in current society. All told, Sean is everything the X-Men stand for and then some. All in all, Sean is a really compelling character who is defined by trauma. The question becomes less about what her traits are and more about where she is on that journey with this team, and how does that affect her both as an individual and as a member of the larger X-Men ideals as a whole. She's got a lot of options in terms of looks, personality, attitude, and overall story that could even be further reinterpreted, as the MCU has already shown they are willing to take liberties, especially with characters who are not as well known to general audiences. So to sum up, Sean is independent, cold, closed off, tough, unwilling to let people in, wrestling with her past, struggling to prove her worth not only to herself, but to her family and to her team, and dedicated to her family above everything else, and full of possibility within the MCU. And all of these character designs bring us to the big question. How does this team work together? And more importantly, what story do they end up telling together? I think it's important to really decide the mission statement of sorts that this movie and the X-Men and the MCU as a whole will represent. Remember, in the comics, they defend the very people that fear and hate them. They put themselves in the way of danger, even though the people they are shielding do not deserve it. And that has to ultimately drive the team in one way or another, even if it's not a direct interpretation. The first big thing with the team is who's in charge. I mean, obviously, Charles is the head, but this also has a tendency to remove him from the team proper in a certain way. He can't be implicated in their endeavors if things go wrong, so he's at a distance. So who leads the team proper? Well, obviously, Scott is the one who should take the reins, but maybe he's someone who has the reins and lacks the confidence to really use them. He doesn't know why he's the one running the show, and this gets him in trouble. And because of these insecurities, Aurora sees herself as the more obvious leader, which can cause a power struggle. And that tension causes the them to butt heads on more than one occasion until they learn to complement each other and work together, which would give the pair not only individual growth, but also a way to find their roles to best serve the team, finding the team with Scott and Aurora not as rivals, but as equals, and finding a cooperative balance that helps better everyone. By contrast to these two, Peter is obviously content to be a follower. He doesn't want the control, and he shows himself struggling to take up initiative, waiting for orders, which then forces him to step up later and learn to read the needs of his teammates without them telling him what to do. In other words, Peter doesn't know how to take initiative, and he needs to figure it out. And I think this applies to his budding romance with Kitty as well. That's a big change from the other movies. I think the prime romantic relationships in this team should be ones which are new, a little awkward, and hasn't been seen in the movies before. And that's a good thing to remember. We haven't seen a relationship between Peter and Kitty on the big screen, at least not in live action. Therefore, this relationship is one which can grow into numerous ways because it's different than anything we might expect. And I think the relationship, whether true to the comic one or not, would be a nice breath of fresh air from the constant love triangle of Logan, Jean, and Scott that shows up in every X-Men movie. It would give us a pair of younger people finding themselves alongside each other in a really interesting way. But Kitty can't be solely defined by Peter. She also needs to be her own person, someone who was so sure of herself that first day and who has slowly learned that things are not always how she perceived them. And I think you can make this work with her sexuality too, by having hints of attraction, maybe even between her and Sean, depending on the ages. And all this is to say that Kitty might be the one character who ends the movie less sure of where she is than when she starts it, because that's the journey she tends to be on. And this obviously makes Kurt the odd man out, but I think that's kind of good for him. Kurt should honestly be the guy who knows how to move in battle by himself. He also would be a good neutral party for all the other characters to come to with their issues, almost like the team therapist or the team priest in Confession. And this causes him to have a lot of clever and optimistic responses until everything gets too real and he has to recount some story of faith or deep thought to rally his teammates together. It gives him a purpose besides just being the funny, agile guy who teleports characters into position, which we haven't really seen from Kurt in a long time. Maybe ever. And I think that this aspect of making him sort of the heart of the X-Men, both in terms of the way he looks and the way he interacts with them, would add a really cool dynamic. And finally, Sean. I think it would be great to use her as the focal point for the audience. She is new, she is guarded, she doesn't know who to trust, she's uncertain about what's ahead of her, but also what's behind her. And it would allow her to work through those moments of trauma and really come together to prove herself as a member of this new family, both allowing her to open up and overcome her own fears. And as I said before, and given the expanding universe of the MCU, that'd be a really interesting way to kick off another New Mutants, showing this woman who's overcome everything and become a real leader. And because of all these dynamics, we really need to lock down who would the X-Men face in their first outing as a team that would show all of these things. I think this team is a whole different animal than the Fantastic Four, and we really need to decide that they are showing the world we are here, and we are not the mutants the world is being told about, and this means having a villain who is both formidable and fairly straightforward. And I also think we shouldn't add too many characters. There's a lot of players on the table and a lot of complexities, and in a team up like this, I think having one driving force that really centers everything and forces the team to work together is a better choice than having another 4 to 7 characters dividing all of the action up. Plus, that's a ton of people to introduce, and I just think that's going to take too much time. This story should be one of unity, both as society comes together and as this team comes together, and that unity should be single-focused. There are other things to look at too. I want to avoid Magneto. He's too interesting, he's too complex, and he really should be someone amassing his own power behind the scenes. And maybe that's part of this. Maybe Charles and Max are on really good terms right now and are recruiting for their own goals. Maybe Max was going after Sean and Charles just happened to get to her first, and now that's dividing these two friends and showing them that their ideals are not in alignment. I also think that you need to have a villain who is based in humanity. That is, someone who's not a mutant. There are a lot of great mutant villains out there, but I don't think they work for the story that should be told. The metaphor of mutants overcoming the prejudices of humans as a representation of insert minority group here overcoming insert majority group here, there needs to be a physical representation of that. But still, you need a character who can handle 6, maybe 7 other characters attacking them at the same time. And I will be honest, I looked everywhere. I went to every corner of the X-Men Rogues Gallery. No pun intended. And I could not find someone who better fit the bill than literally the most obvious choice. You want a big one-man army, you call the Juggernaut. And it makes sense, he's got a vendetta against Charles, but I think we can make this more interesting, because Cain Marko could be a pawn in a larger game. I think it'd be really interesting if the movie presents itself as fairly straightforward, only to towards the end realize he's working for one of those anti-mutant organizations that wants to expose the X-Men as dangerous and blame them for all of this destruction that the Juggernaut's causing. And it could be something that takes Charles, the guy who usually shuts down the Juggernaut, out of the picture, which forces our other telepath, Sean, to step up and prove herself. I think that you could take this in a very simple way, but then add really interesting layers to both develop the world at large, a future story, and the one being told, and help these characters grow together, and all focused on one big Juggernaut. So let me break down my final thoughts. Charles is a nurturing parent with an edge of neglect and emotional manipulation who recruits this team under the guise of protecting them, but ultimately has his own agenda. Scott is a straightforward do-gooder with loads of self-doubt and past struggles that lead to an obsessive need for order and control. Aurora is a confident, powerful woman who has the potential for greatness, but gets in her own way both through her image of herself and her view of the world around her. Peter is the ultimate team player, even to the point where he actively takes unneeded risks because he cannot find his value outside of protecting those around him and carrying their burdens as his own. Kurt is divided by several different avenues, but ultimately has to blend humor and heart in a way that lifts his teammates up and deflects conversations off of his own insecurities. Kitty's a little bit of a wild card, searching for her footing in this team and in this world, and finding her values being challenged as time continues. And finally, Sean is the newcomer, finding her place in all of this and working to heal both the known and unknown wounds that she's carrying with her, while proving her worth both to herself and to her newfound family. But at the end of the day, none of this is up to me. Obviously, these are 7 characters out of nearly 100, and it could be many other stories that could be told, and this may be too limiting for Marvel's ideas. Maybe they want to tell a story with new minor characters who haven't been on screen before, or X-Force, or Excalibur, or one of the dozens of other groups that I don't have time to list right now. There are so many possible choices with the X-Men that I feel like this might be the toughest decision Marvel's going to have to make, since they chose which characters in Infinity War got dusted. And all in all, again, I hope that whatever movie comes out of this just has solid casting choices to effectively tell the stories that need to be told. I also hope that the movie does justice to Marvel's mutant misfits and ultimately tells a compelling and interesting story for all to see, myself included. I want to continue to be enchanted by X-Men movies the way I was when I saw the first one and the way I am when I read the comics, and I am more than willing to sacrifice my own ideas and expectations to let that enchantment happen, because ultimately this process is too complex for me to handle. Talk about complex casting. Thank you everyone for watching this video. I would love to hear what you think of my breakdowns of these characters. Were there other pieces that I may have missed? What parts of these comics would you like to see come to life on screen? Let me know in the comments down below. Help me keep growing this channel by liking and sharing this video around. Check out Patreon to get early access to some of these videos and even see behind the scenes aspects of certain things. And to ensure you never miss a single video, whether they be tough act to follow, one to watch, welcome to the party pal, or now complex casting, be sure to subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and as I always say, thanks for taking the time to get Ploominated.